Okay, so I was at a cafe the other day, right? And at the table next to me, there's this woman, and she's clearly having a rough time, just visibly upset.
Uh-huh.
And within seconds, literally seconds, her friends are all leaning in, what's wrong, sharing their own bad day stories. It was like this immediate, intricate web of emotional support just right there over their lattes.
Yeah, you see that a lot, that immediate mobilization of care.
Exactly. But then I looked over at another table, group of guys, and one of them had that same look, just completely checked out, staring into his coffee cup. His friends noticed. I saw them notice.
Yeah.
One gives him this quick pat on the back. Another one cracks a joke about like last night's game or something.
Yep.
They ask, "You all right, man?" He just nods.
I was unmanned.
Yep. And that was it. The conversation just moved on. The problem was sort of acknowledged for maybe half a second and then boom, collectively buried under small talk.
That silence, as you said, can be incredibly loud, can it?
It really was. Louder than all the chatter at the women's table. And you see that scene play out everywhere, all the time. It's that brief, awkward moment where, like, help is needed, but it's not really offered, not properly. And a simple nod is enough to just pretend everything's fine.
But it isn't fine, is it? That's the thing.
No. And what happens after that guy leaves the table, he doesn't just leave the feeling there with the empty coffee cup, does he? He takes it home with him. And that quiet, almost invisible moment, that feels like the starting point for this much bigger and, frankly, much more dangerous problem we're seeing.
That anecdote is such a perfect, almost painful way to get into this. It really crystallizes what's become a major sociological issue and, honestly, a public health concern, this rising tide of male loneliness.
Yeah.
It illustrates that exact moment of truth, doesn't it? The need is there. It's maybe even recognized on some level, but the social scripts available to those men, that sort of rigid adherence to self-reliance, it just leads to deflection and ultimately isolation.
That's the absolute crux of it, isn't it? We're not just talking about guys who, like being alone. We're talking about a whole social infrastructure almost that actively fails men when they most need support. It kind of forces them into being isolated.
Right.
So for this deep dive, we've really dug into quite a bit of research studies looking right at the connections between traditional ideas of masculinity, chronic isolation, and then, well, these pretty terrifying digital pipelines that seem to exploit that exact vulnerability.
Exactly. So our mission today really is to unpack that specific relationship. How is loneliness sort of created and then reinforced by these social norms? And then, crucially, how do these digital spaces, like the quote-unquote manosphere, step into that gap? How do they offer these really dangerous, overly simplified answers when real-life emotional support structures just aren't there or aren't accessed?
Yeah, well, we want to give you a shortcut maybe to understanding the really complex, intertwined things going on here, because it is complex.
It absolutely is. #TagI, the sociological foundation of loneliness and male vulnerability. So maybe the best place to start is just nailing down what we actually mean by loneliness, because it's a much more complicated thing than just being physically by yourself.
Right, it's not just solitude.
Not at all. Loneliness is really defined as a painful gap. It's a subjective feeling, this perceived difference between the quality and the quantity of social connections that a person wants versus what they actually have.
A gap. Okay. That makes sense. It's about the desire versus the reality.
Precisely. It's a state of emotional and, frankly, mental distress that comes from that gap.
And the research, it doesn't just lump all that distress together, does it? It seems to break it down into different sort of shades or types, depending on what kind of connection is actually missing.
Yeah.
Which feels like a really useful way to diagnose the problem, right?
Absolutely. It helps us understand the specific nature of the deficit. So typically we talk about 3 key types. First, there's what's called social loneliness. This is maybe the most basic type. It's the absence of that broader, maybe more superficial social network, casual acquaintances, people you can call on for mundane tasks, that sort of thing.
So, like, the guy who looks around and realizes he doesn't really have anyone to just casually watch the game with, or maybe help him move a couch. He might have colleagues, but not really? Comrades?
Exactly that. Peers, but not pals, perhaps.
Yeah.
That network for just day-to-day social activity isn't there.
Okay, so that's social loneliness. What's next?
Then there's emotional loneliness, and this one cuts much deeper. This is about the lack of close, intimate connections, those relationships where there's real trust, where you feel you have emotional freedom.
Right, the kind of relationship where you can actually look someone in the eye and say, No, actually, I'm really not all right today, and no, they'll listen without immediately jumping in to fix it or judge you.
Precisely. And that requires vulnerability, doesn't it? Which, as we saw in your cafe example, is often incredibly difficult for men raised with traditional norms to access or express.
Definitely. And the third type?
The third type is existential loneliness. This hits at a really fundamental level. It's that feeling of being sort of rootless, lacking meaning, maybe disconnected from a broader sense of purpose in life.
Wow. Okay. So that's like what's the point of all this feeling?
Exactly. It's profound. And understanding these three types, social, emotional, and existential, is so important because it shows us that, just giving a lonely man a superficial hobby group might help with social loneliness, maybe.
It's a box.
But it's not going to solve the core issue if those deeper emotional and existential voids are still there, still aching.
Which brings us right back to that guy at the cafe table and the elephant in the room. Traditional masculinity.
Yeah.
These core ideals we're taught, be strong, don't show weakness, be invulnerable, rely only on yourself. They actively demand emotional suppression, don't they?
They absolutely do. They function as this enormous social barrier to the very things needed to combat emotional and existential loneliness, connection, vulnerability, interdependence.
And this demand, it creates something you mentioned earlier, the self-reliance paradox.
Yes. And the research on this is just devastatingly clear. The very trait that Western society often encourages and rewards in men, this fierce, unyielding independence, is also a primary mechanism that isolates them.
So the more you try to be the ideal, strong, silent type, the lonelier you actually get.
That's exactly what the data shows. Higher levels of self-reliance are strongly, consistently associated with increased feelings of chronic loneliness among men. And beyond that, it's identified as a leading factor in depressive symptoms.
Wow. So the system basically forces them into this trap. Either you conform to the ideal and risk being totally isolated, or you try to seek help and risk what? Social failure.
Precisely. Risking social failure, or at least perceiving it that way. Because if you break that ideal, if you admit you need help, what are the costs? What are the fears?
Yeah, what are the specific costs? Is it just embarrassment?
It goes deeper than just embarrassment, though that's part of it. The cost is this profound stigma, often called the stigma of distress. Men learn very early on to avoid asking for help because they fear losing status, respect, maybe even economic standing.
Like, someone might subconsciously worry they won't get a promotion if their boss knows they're struggling with anxiety or that their friends will see them differently.
Exactly. The potential cost of that emotional disclosure feels much higher, much more immediate than the slow, grinding cost of continued isolation. So they prioritize maintaining that image, that strong, autonomous, got-it-handled image, over actually reaching out for the support they need.
That nod at the cafe table.
Yeah.
It's the physical manifestation of prioritizing the image. Just a tiny movement, but it says so much.
It really does. It's a performance of strength, even in distress.
And the consequences of this constant emotional suppression are so dangerous, right? Because if asking for help is discouraged, if it's stigmatized, they can't address the emotional pain directly, so they end up resorting to these really harmful coping strategies instead.
That's absolutely right. Instead of confiding in a friend or talking to a therapist or even just admitting vulnerability to a partner, what do? Often the research shows they turn to things like substance abuse, drinking too much, using drugs, or reckless, risky behaviors, driving too fast, picking fights.
Or just burying themselves in work.
Exactly. Prolonged work hours, which only deepens the isolation, paradoxically. Or just withdrawing completely. And in the most severe, tragic cases, it can lead to suicide.
It's terrifying. And the research even suggests, doesn't it, that men sometimes experience more shame and rejection than women when they do show vulnerability.
Yes, precisely because it violates that explicit social expectation of autonomy and strength that's so central to sort of hegemonic masculinity. They get penalized by society and often just as powerfully by themselves for failing to live up to that impossible ideal.
Okay, so if direct emotional connection, that kind of vulnerable sharing, is effectively blocked by these ingrained norms, men still need to connect somehow, right? They have to find ways to build bonds that don't compromise that fragile masculine identity.
That's right. And this leads us to understand the primary arena where many men do form connections, which is through productive activities.
Productive activities. So
Yeah.
like doing stuff together.
Exactly. Their social infrastructure, if you like, is often built on shared goals, joint efforts, or roles that actually comply with masculine expectations rather than being built on shared vulnerability or emotional disclosure.
Okay, give me some examples, like work.
Work is a huge one. Think about the bonding that happens in a military unit, maybe, or among firefighters, or even in a specific skilled trade like construction. The camaraderie often centers on competence, on execution, on shared risk or shared accomplishment. The conversation might be about the task, but the connection happens through the task.
Right. It's shoulder-to-shoulder connection rather than face-to-face.
That's a great way to put it. So connection happens through activity. A really classic example, which one study investigated quite closely, is the strong social connectedness you often find in competitive sports teams.
Yeah, the locker room dynamic.
Exactly. In that context, traditionally masculine traits, strength, stoicism, playing through pain, endurance, they're not just present, they're highly emphasized and valued. A man's identity, his belonging, is tied directly to his physical role, his performance on the field.
But what happens when that performance stops? Like if a player gets injured?
That's where you see the fragility. When a player in that kind of environment suffers a serious, maybe career-threatening injury, that whole social network, which seemed so robust and supportive just days before, suddenly becomes incredibly precarious for them.
Even if they're still around the team?
Yes, even if they're physically present at practices or games, maybe on the sidelines, they often experience this profound psychological and social detachment. Why? Because they're prevented from performing the central productive role that anchored their identity and their sense of belonging within that group.
Wow. So the connection was conditional all along.
In a way, yes. Conditional on their ability to contribute in that specific physical masculine way. And when that condition, the productivity, the physical competence is removed, loneliness can just rush into that vacuum.
And this vulnerability, it's not just limited to sports injuries, right? It applies whenever that productive capacity is challenged. You see it with men whose whole social world might be tied up in their role as a successful provider, for instance.
Absolutely. If they face job loss or maybe forced retirement or even a debilitating illness or injury outside of sport, maintaining those social connections that were built around that role becomes incredibly difficult. They don't just lose their income or their status. They often lose their primary means of social engagement and belonging.
And they fall back on that ingrained self-reliance, even when they're desperate for connection. Which leads to the state you mentioned, social inertia. Right. Especially among older men living alone.
Yes, social inertia. It's a term used in some research to describe this feeling of being overwhelmingly stuck in loneliness. They might deeply desire connection, but their lifelong masculine conditioning compels them to just get on with it, to avoid being a burden, especially on adult children or other family members.
So what does that actually look like in practice? This inertia?
Well, it's like the psychological weight that makes initiating even a simple phone call or accepting an invitation feel like climbing a mountain. The desire for connection is there, absolutely. But the emotional fatigue from the loneliness itself, combined with that deep-seated fear of being seen as needy or boring or just a burden, it creates this mental blockade.
So they just stop trying?
Often, yes. Or the effort required feels too overwhelming. The social network they had was dependent on a role provider, worker, teammate that they maybe can't fulfill anymore. And the idea of building a new network, one based perhaps more on vulnerability or shared experience rather than shared tasks, just feels too daunting, too foreign.
Which just keeps the cycle of isolation going.
Exactly. It perpetuates itself. The inertia feeds the loneliness, and the loneliness fuels the inertia. It's a really difficult trap to break out of.
Okay, so if the coffee table, the workplace, the locker room, if these traditional physical spaces are structured in ways that often fail men emotionally, where does that guy who just nodded his head at the cafe, where does he go next?
Well, increasingly, where does anyone go when they feel alienated or misunderstood in the physical world?
They go online.
Exactly. He leaves the physical world where his vulnerability might be penalized or ignored, and he turns to the screen. And this is where that vulnerability, that loneliness, that lack of real support meets. Well, it meets radicalized self-help, often through the very high visibility of figures sometimes called manfluencers.
Right. People like Andrew Tate, who's maybe the most visible example recently. They act as this kind of highly visible gateway, don't they? A way into this sprawling online ecosystem that gets called the manosphere.
Yes, it's a vast network of websites, forums, YouTube channels, social media groups, all promoting, to varying degrees, a particular brand of masculinity. And these gateway figures, they really capitalize on men's feelings of inadequacy, social anxiety, dating frustrations,
All the stuff we've been talking about.
all of it. And they promise this quick fix solution, usually based on a hyper-traditional, often aggressive, and incredibly simplistic brand of masculinity. The narrative is so seductive, isn't it? It's basically, you're failing because you're weak, because society has made you weak. But I have the secret knowledge, the key to make you strong, dominant, successful.
And the language they use is so key, creating that immediate sense of an in-group, people who get it versus everyone else who doesn't. You hear these terms thrown around constantly.
Absolutely. Terminology is crucial for building that shared identity and worldview.
Like beta male, referring to a guy who's seen as submissive, weak, maybe a simp. Contrasted, of course, with the alpha male, the dominant, successful leader type.
Right, the supposed pinnacle of the hierarchy.
And then there's this other one, the sigma male. What's that about? It seems different.
Ah, the sigma male. Yes, that's portrayed as the lone wolf type. The guy who's supposedly so independent, so self-sufficient, that he's indifferent to women and actually exists outside the traditional alpha-beta social hierarchy altogether.
Okay, that sounds convenient.
It's incredibly insidious, actually, because it appeals specifically to those men who feel rejected by the hierarchy, who feel they can't compete or win in the traditional sense. It cleverly reframes their isolation, their social withdrawal, not as failure, but as a chosen path. A badge of honor, even.
Turning loneliness into high status.
Wow. It offers this high-status justification for social failure and retreat, making isolation seem like a powerful choice rather than a painful consequence.
We can actually trace a pretty common path, can't we? A sort of trajectory into these communities, sometimes described as the lost boy trajectory.
Yes, that's a term used to describe a common profile. These are often young men who are dealing with significant challenges. Maybe repeated romantic rejection, intense frustration with dating apps or modern dating culture, profound feelings of inadequacy about their own masculinity, often compounded by just general social isolation. They feel lost.
Lost, and without a map, presumably.
Exactly. And this often involves what some researchers call arrested development. These might be young men who are noticeably off time regarding those traditional developmental milestones of early adulthood, finishing education, getting a stable job, forming long-term relationships, moving out of their parents' home.
Right, and sometimes this leads to them being neat.
Yes, neat, not in education, employment, or training. That status is really critical because it often signifies this vacuum of purpose and structure in their lives.
Yeah, if you're not in school or work, you lose all those built-in, sort of natural, low-stakes opportunities for social interaction that most people rely on to build their networks.
Precisely. They like the daily structure, the shared goals, the casual interactions, and crucially, they often lack the momentum needed to navigate adult life successfully. This leaves them feeling stuck, without legitimate social support, and therefore highly, highly vulnerable to the simplistic answers and the sense of belonging offered by the manosphere's ideology.
So they're lonely, they're frustrated, they feel like they're failing,
Yeah.
and then they find these online communities.
Yeah.
What's the first thing they latch onto?
Often, the initial offering, the first stage of ideological buy-in, is what's called the red pill.
Okay, the Matrix reference. Wake up to reality.
Exactly. The red pill phase tends to focus on this almost neoliberal promise of individual effort. It tells them, success is achievable, but you have to put in the work. You have to optimize yourself.
And what kind of work?
Well, it encourages things like looks maxing, which is obsessively trying to improve physical appearance, sometimes through extreme measures, or money maxing, focusing solely on financial acquisition as the key to status, or learning game. These are techniques, often derived from the pickup artist community, designed to manipulate social interactions to achieve romantic or sexual success.
So it's all very transactional. Improve yourself, gain leverage, get results.
Very much so. It's framed as this entirely achievable, almost mechanical route to gaining control, status, and ultimately the attention they crave. It puts the power, supposedly, back in their hands.
The research shows that often doesn't work, right? Especially for the underlying issues.
Exactly, because while some of those self-improvement efforts might have superficial benefits, they rarely address the deep-seated structural problems, the chronic loneliness, the underlying mental health issues like depression or anxiety, that social inertia we talked about. They're trying to fix an internal problem with purely external solutions.
So when that massive individual effort the red pill promise,
Yeah.
inevitably fails to deliver that deeper sense of connection or cure the loneliness. What happens then?
That's often when the ideology shifts, sometimes quite dramatically. This is the turn towards the much darker, more nihilistic black pill.
Okay, so red pill is work harder, black pill is.
Black pill is basically, it's hopeless and it's not your fault. It's essentially a form of scientifically disguised fatalism.
Fatalism, how so?
It completely dismisses the idea of individual effort or self-improvement having any real impact, particularly when it comes to attracting partners. It claims that success is almost entirely determined by fixed external factors, primarily immutable biological characteristics, especially physical appearance.
So it's like, if you weren't born conventionally attractive, you have no chance no matter what you do.
That's the core message, yes.
Yeah.
It often relies on heavily flawed, cherry-picked interpretations of evolutionary psychology or genetics to make these deterministic claims sound scientific. But its real power isn't in the science, it's in the psychological need it fulfills.
Because it offers an excuse, an explanation for their failure that isn't about them.
Precisely. It provides what's called an exculpatory narrative. It absolves the individual of personal responsibility. The message becomes, you didn't fail because you weren't trying hard enough, or because you have unresolved emotional issues, or because you lack social skills. You failed because the system, or biology itself, is fundamentally rigged against you.
That's a powerful shift from I need to fix myself to the world is broken.
It's a huge shift, and it often marks a significant point of ideological radicalization as the individual fully embraces this narrative of external victimhood rather than pursuing any path of internal growth or genuine connection. It offers comfort in a bleak sort of way, but it closes the door on hope. So once someone is sort of embedded in these communities, especially those leaning towards the black pill, the core rhetoric they encounter and participate in is this systematic manufacturing of victimhood.
Manufacturing it. You mean it's not always genuine?
Well, the feelings of frustration and loneliness might be very real. But the explanation for those feelings, the narrative constructed around them, is often strategically manufactured. They consistently frame men, specifically, the men within their group, as the primary victims of modern society, particularly of feminism, social justice movements, or what they broadly term work culture.
And that tactic, framing themselves as victims, what does that achieve for them?
It's incredibly strategic. By casting themselves as an oppressed group, it allows them to adopt the language, the posture, and sometimes even the tactics of genuinely marginalized groups. They paint themselves as these righteous underdogs, bravely speaking a painful truth that the rest of society is too politically correct or too blind to see. It lends a sense of moral authority to their grievances.
But crucially, you're saying these aren't really rational arguments based on evidence.
Often, no. They rely heavily on what we call affective arguments. These arguments are grounded less in factual substance and more in performance, in generating intense emotion, particularly outrage, anger, resentment, and incredulity. The goal is to trigger an emotional response, not necessarily a logical one.
And the research found some pretty extreme examples of this kind of effective reasoning, didn't it? Especially interviews with forum members.
Yes, some really quite chilling examples that show the sheer extremity this ideology can reach. In one quite shocking moment documented in the research, a participant went so far as to equate his experience of a lifetime of involuntary celibacy being in cell with the trauma of being violently stabbed or raped.
Wait, what? How did he even justify that comparison?
His argument, if you can call it that, was that rape or stabbing, while horrific, are, quote, point-in-time flashes, whereas his loneliness, his inceldom, was this constant slow-burn torture day in, day out, therefore making his suffering somehow equivalent or even greater.
That comparison is just horrifying. Equating a lack of desired connection with the violent violation of rape, it completely minimizes the trauma of sexual assault.
It's absolutely chilling, and it really underscores how utterly distorted the sense of perceived injustice, the sense of victimhood, can become for some individuals deep inside these communities. We really have to pause and recognize the extremity of that kind of dehumanizing narrative, one that elevates their own distress, however real it feels to them, above the most violent traumas imaginable.
It's staggering. What other kinds of effective arguments do they use?
Another very common one is framing any kind of social progress made by women or minority groups as a zero-sum loss for men, particularly white and Asian men, who often feel they should be higher status.
So like if more women get into graduate school, or if there's a movement like Black Lives Matter or #MeToo gains traction, they see that as something being taken away from them.
Exactly. The underlying logic, driven by profound status anxiety, is that society is a fixed pie. Any gain for another group is perceived not just as equality, but as a direct reduction in their own worth, their own opportunities, their own rightful place. This fuels feelings of being overlooked, ignored, or actively discriminated against by a system they believe now unfairly favors others.
It's all based on feeling, on grievance, rather than facts.
Largely, yes. And this emotional manipulation helps explain why many of these communities, particularly incel forums, function less like coherent political movements with policy goals and more like what researchers call an effective counterpublic.
An effective counterpublic, what does that mean?
It means their primary purpose isn't really about achieving external political change. It's about creating and maintaining an internal emotional climate. They exist to reinforce shared grievances, to constantly evoke and circulate negative emotions. Think about the notorious use of terms like rage fuel posts designed specifically to incite anger, or suicide fuel posts that deepen despair.
So the shared negativity is the point.
In many ways, yes. This intense shared emotional resonance, this constant immersion in negativity, creates what researchers describe as affective stickiness. The shared pain, the shared outrage, becomes the glue holding the community together. For many members, it might be the only place they've ever felt truly understood, the only source of belonging they feel they have.
Even if it's a belonging based entirely on shared misery.
Precisely, and that stickiness makes it incredibly hard to leave. They prioritize that feeling of shared pain, that negative validation, over their own individual recovery or well-being. It ensures members keep coming back, keep engaging, even when they might intellectually recognize that the community is actively worsening their mental health.
Okay, let's shift slightly to talk about a specific demographic finding that comes up in the research, which seems to help explain the intense appeal of these spaces for some individuals. That's the high prevalence of neurodivergence, specifically people on the autism spectrum within these communities. Why do these spaces seem to be such a psychological fit?
Yeah, this is a really important and sensitive point that the research highlights. There appear to be several interconnected reasons, often related to social anxiety and cognitive style. For instance, individuals with autism often struggle, sometimes intensely, with navigating the complex, subtle, nonverbal social cues. The fleeting facial expressions, the tone of voice, the implied context that govern so much of real-world social interaction, especially dating and forming friendships.
Which must be exhausting and anxiety-provoking.
Incredibly so. So text-based online communication, like you find in these forums, strips away a lot of that overwhelming cognitive load. There are no facial expressions to misread, no confusing tones of voice. This can make the manosphere forums feel significantly safer, less ambiguous, and much less anxiety-inducing than trying to navigate the complexities of offline social life.
So the internet offers a refuge, in a way. But the downside is it pulls them away from potentially developing those crucial real-world social skills they might need.
That's exactly the potential danger, yes. It can become a substitute rather than a stepping stone. Secondly, there's a cognitive style aspect. Some research suggests individuals on the spectrum may be more prone to what's called black and white thinking, or a preference for systems, rules, and certainty. Okay. So they can be intensely drawn to systems that claim to be rational, predictable, logical, and certain. The black pill ideology, with its deterministic, pseudo-scientific claims about immutable biological laws governing attraction and social success, it offers precisely that sense of certainty and explanatory power.
Right. It takes the messy, unpredictable, often painful world of human relationships and dating, which feels overwhelmingly fuzzy and constantly anxiety-provoking, and boils it down to these simple, supposedly scientific rules.
Exactly. It weaponizes their desire for clear, unambiguous truths, turning complex human phenomena like love, attraction, and connection into these simplistic deterministic equations. If X, then Y. It provides a framework that feels logical and controllable, even if it's based on flawed premises.
And there was another factor mentioned, too, about development, maybe involving parents.
Yes, the developmental path is also relevant for some. The research found instances where parental overprotectiveness, perhaps triggered by an early diagnosis of autism or significant social difficulties, inadvertently prevented crucial social learning experiences during formative years.
Like maybe not letting them navigate tricky social situations on their own or take social risks.
Potentially, yes. Shielding them too much from potential failure or rejection, which, while well-intentioned, can hinder the development of social resilience and skills. This lack of early, real-world social practice can contribute to them being significantly off time later in life, compounding their social isolation and making them even more vulnerable to extremist online messaging that promises easy answers and bypasses the need for nuanced social skills. #TagV, Pathways to Resilience and Interventions. Okay, so we've painted a pretty bleak picture of the problem. The crucial question then becomes, what can actually be done? What do effective interventions look like?
Yeah, how do we help guys avoid falling into these traps or help them get out if they're already in?
Well, the research strongly suggests that the primary goal for any effective intervention has got to be addressing those damaging traditional masculine norms head on. We need to focus on fostering a genuine sense of belonging within families, workplaces, communities, but, and this is crucial, do it in a way that allows men to preserve a sense of their masculine identity.
So not forcing them into a model of vulnerability that they're just going to instinctively reject because it feels alien or weak, according to their conditioning.
Exactly. It's about meeting them where they are. This means respecting that masculine preference we talked about earlier, the preference for action, for doing things together, and for voluntary participation. Force something on them, it likely won't work.
So what kind of models do work then? The research pointed to some successful examples.
Yes, things like the men's sheds movement, which originated in Australia but has spread globally. These are community spaces where men can come together, usually older or retired men, to work on practical projects, woodworking, metalworking, repairing things.
Shoulder to shoulder again.
Precisely. The focus is on the shared activity, the tangible outcome. But the emotional connection, the support network, develops naturally, almost incidentally, around that shared task. And the research emphasizes that the voluntary nature of participation is absolutely key for engagement. They choose to be there.
That makes sense. What else?
Other examples include utilizing existing trusted community hubs, like piloting health promotion initiatives or mental health awareness in barbershops, places men already frequent and feel comfortable in, or simply establishing low-key coffee groups specifically for older men who might be battling that social inertia we discussed.
So the key is making the path to connection feel low pressure, maybe activity-focused, and non-judgmental.
Exactly. And ideally, having facilitators or leaders involved who understand that internal conflict men often feel around help seeking and who can provide support without triggering that immediate defensive self-reliance mechanism. It requires a subtle touch.
Okay, that's the offline world. What about the digital front, where so much of this radicalization actually happens?
On the digital front, the focus really needs to be twofold: fostering emotional intelligence and building critical digital literacy skills. Young men, especially, need to be explicitly taught how to recognize the specific terminology and slang used in the manosphere, words like looks-maxing, incel, foids, cuck, alpha, beta, red pill, black pill, even seemingly innocuous terms related to game.
Why is recognizing the slang so important?
Because they need to understand the connection between that specific language and the often extreme misogynistic or white supremacist ideologies lurking just beneath the surface. That awareness is the first step towards building resilience against the kind of online manipulation and grooming that draws people into these harmful echo chambers. It's about inoculation, essentially.
And alongside that critical awareness, we also need positive alternatives, right?
Absolutely. We desperately need more visible, positive, egalitarian male role models, both offline in communities, schools, and families, but also online, directly countering the narratives pushed by the manfluencers.
So men who demonstrate that true masculinity can actually be defined by things like connection, empathy, integrity, emotional intelligence, rather than just dominance, aggression, or how much money you make.
Precisely. Some former manosphere members interviewed in the research stressed how vital it is to have high-profile figures, online commentators, maybe even influencers who actively promote critical thinking, nuanced perspectives, and just level-headed viewpoints, rather than simply peddling outrage and simplistic answers for clicks.
Okay, and finally, what about the guys who are already deep in, especially those who've swallowed the black pill? They often seem so consumed by hopelessness. How do you even begin to challenge that?
That's maybe the toughest challenge, because the research indicates that many men involved in these forums deep down know they're unhelpful. They can recognize the negative impact these spaces are having on their mental health, on their outlook on life.
But they feel stuck.
Yeah.
Like they have no alternative.
Exactly. They're caught in that social inertia. They often lack a clear path forward in the real world, and the black pill narrative tells them there's no point trying anyway because failure is predetermined. So they stay.
So interventions need to directly combat that hopelessness.
Yes, interventions need to be profoundly life-affirming and intensely practical. They have to move beyond just vague advice like be more positive. They need to provide concrete, achievable, incremental self-improvement tasks, things like support for getting back into education or training, help learning a practical skill, guidance on structured exercise routines, maybe basic social skills coaching.
But, and this sounds critical, separated entirely from the toxic ideology.
Completely separated. The focus must be on building real-world competence, confidence, and connection, detached from the pseudoscientific justifications and the misogynistic or racist framing that permeates the manosphere. The support needs to be targeted, practical, and genuinely constructive, providing real guidance and tangible steps forward for those lost boys who are struggling to find momentum, purpose, and hope in their lives. It's about showing them a different path is possible. Hashtag Zex. Conclusion outro.
So when you put it all together, what we've really seen today is this powerful, destructive, negative feedback loop, haven't we? Loneliness, often stemming from or exacerbated by outdated social norms of male independence and stoicism, acts almost like a public health threat.
A silence epidemic, some call it.
And this engineered vulnerability, this deep need for connection and meaning, is then systematically identified and exploited by these digital communities. Communities that basically trade in outrage and fatalism, often wrapped up in this false veneer of scientific certainty.
Right. Offering these incredibly simplistic, ultimately destructive answers for what are actually really complex structural issues of social isolation, economic anxiety, a lack of purpose, mental health challenges.
And the true cost of all this emotional suppression, this adherence to the strong and silent ideal.
Yeah.
It's profound, isn't it? It's not just about social isolation, as bad as that is.
No, it goes deeper. It's the creation of this vast chasm of meaning and purpose in men's lives, and it's into that chasm that these radical ideologies rush to fill the void. By adopting something like the black pill, men might gain this temporary negative form of self-esteem, the feeling they've discovered a harsh truth that the rest of society is too naive or politically correct to see, but they sacrifice any real potential for genuine growth, for authentic connection, for actual happiness.
It's a terrible trade-off. And it highlights that the system's teaching men to fear vulnerability, whether that fear manifests as just a quick, awkward deflection over coffee or as a hateful, misogynistic screed posted on some anonymous online forum. These systems don't actually protect men at all.
No, they endanger them.
They just redirect their pain, either outward, often towards women or society at large, or they force it inward, burying it so deep it becomes toxic, poisoning them from the inside out. Which leads me to a final thought, really. Perhaps the greatest challenge we face isn't just about defeating a specific online ideology, as important as that is. Maybe the real challenge is much quieter, much closer to home. It's about normalizing the simple, courageous act of asking for help, and just as importantly, learning how to truly accept it when it's offered.
That hits the nail on the head.
Because the work of true strength, it seems, isn't about building higher walls of self-reliance. Maybe it's about having the courage to be seen, truly seen, in all our messy human vulnerability.